So thank you so much, Isis, and appreciate all your patience as we are joining together via Zoom for this virtual event. I just want to give you a welcome to the Area Studies Global Comics lecture on the making of Angola Jenga and Run for It with Marcelo de Salech, a partnership between University Libraries International and Area Studies Department and the Center for Latin American Studies, Afro-Brazilian Art and Activism lecture series, which Isis shared a little bit more about. Since 2019, the University Libraries Area Studies Global Comic Lecture Series has used the medium of comics to explore pressing global and transnational issues through distinct regional perspectives. The series is sponsored by a generous grant that was received by the U.S. Department of Education Title VI for the Ohio State University's Center for Latin American Studies, Center for Slavic and East European Studies, and East Asian Studies Centers. We are very lucky to offer simultaneous interpretation today in English and Portuguese by Professor Raquel Luciana de Souza, made possible by the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. And we are very grateful to Raquel and our friends of the Billy Ireland for making this bilingual event possible. We also are very happy to report that as of yesterday, select works, the ones that we will be hearing about today, will now be available through our library collection. And I want to thank Pete Reesley from the University Libraries for assisting to make sure that we have all of Marcelo's works. And lastly, I'd like to acknowledge our collaboration with the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and its Literature and Cultural Colloquium organizers, Dr. Lucia Costigan and Dr. Jonathan Burgoyne. And lastly, I want to thank Dr. Isis Baracosta, Assistant Professor in Contemporary Brazilian Cultures and Literary Studies. Dr. Baracosta is really the event organizer today and has been behind this entire event. She has worked tirelessly for months to plan this engagement during a pandemic. And I just really want to personally thank her for everything she has done to make this possible. And if you could please join me in a Zoom round of applause for Isis, and who I'd like to introduce now to share some remarks.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Thank you. Like, I do not know which one comes first, who is behind what. If you were not the one to start a global comic series, we wouldn't have gone into this whole plan of the, I don't know, 18 guests this semester. So it's been really wonderful to work with you. It seems para os que falam português, não tem razão para vocês se desesperarem. Nós não ficaremos falando inglês aqui sem parar. We need to activate the globe, the little globe, so as our event can happen bilingually. Okay. Pamela, maybe Jared and Cesar can explain how this works. Sim?
Yeah, so as Pamela mentioned, we're going to have simultaneous translation for the event. So as you can imagine, the majority of the event will be in Portuguese. So for those of you who don't speak Portuguese or would prefer to listen to the event in English, you just have to go to the bar at the bottom of your screen. There will be a little globe icon and you'll just click on that. And then you'll select the English language channel. From there, you'll get the simultaneous translation from Raquel. And then any questions or any problems you're having with that, just let us know in the chat. So enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Para quem quiser acompanhar a palestra em português, basta selecionar a opção em português no globinho que está na barra de opções, no ícone do globo. E caso vocês queiram escutar a palestra inteiramente em inglês, também há essa opção. Então fica a critério de cada participante em qual língua irá escutar. Se você não quiser fazer tradução e quiser ouvir as línguas que forem faladas, pode deixar também na opção off. E aí tenhamos todos uma boa apresentação.
Great. And so I just want to thank you all. We are so lucky to have not only the OSU community, but many people that are joining us from other institutions. And we hope that you may come back to subsequent Global Comics series. And with this, it is my greatest pleasure to introduce our Global Comics Latin American Studies artist, Marcelo Desalech. Marcelo Desalech is a Brazilian comic artist, illustrator, and professor. His acclaimed graphic novel, Cumbe, Run For It, and Angola Jenga, Kingdom of Runaway Slaves, explore the history of slavery and the struggles for freedom in colonial Brazil. Cumbe was the recipient of the prestigious Eisner Award for the best US edition of international materials in 2018. His epic novel, Angola Jenga, recently published in the US, narrates the rise and fall of the Quilombo dos Palmares, Brazil's largest Quilombo community. Please join me in welcoming Marcelo Desalech.
Olá a todos, é prazer estar aqui. Muito obrigado.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your invitation, Isis, Pamela, and all people involved, the institution, Ohio State University, and all institutions involved in this conversation. It's great to be able to participate in this conversation. And I know there are other artists, Brazilian artists, that are participating in this gathering. Moments of exchange about the topics we've been researching, cartoons and also history, Latin American history, and these relationships throughout the Atlantic. I am going to comment now particularly quickly my biography and then about the books Cumbe, Angola Jenga. Then I'm going to spend more time with Angola Jenga, but I also have to start reading a short text, an introduction, speaking a little bit about the current moment in Brazil, which I think is important for me as a citizen to read this, though it's obvious, though it's something that many people may know, but I think it's my duty here to position myself in vis-a-vis that situation. I would like to regret the terrible current moment in Brazil in which we have a flagrant ongoing genocide, persecution of artists, professors, teachers, a moment of inequality, praising of misogyny and racism and negationism towards science and authoritarian regimes. The virus is the reality that humanity has faced throughout its history, but the current criminal management of this crisis, particularly for more impoverished countries, is a cruel reality that we need to face. And diminishing the impact of the virus has to do with bringing down corporations and governments that are not in defense of life and are praising death. Within this context, I don't have any doubts that the dialogue that is fostered by art should be a part of this process of overcoming and participating in this process and in this exchange. I think it's part of this, promoting this change. And on behalf of peoples who have been historically marginalized in the Americas. Well, I had to say that in some ways because the current moment in Brazil is not easy. We have 3,000 people dying every day, and these are official records, and these numbers may increase, unfortunately. The current reality demonstrates that we may have to deal with that for months. And we know very well that the main issue is we have a virus on one hand, but the management of this crisis is a problem that we need to face It is a historical, it is a political issue rather. Thank you. Well, I believe very much that the kind of history that we are building, many artists in Brazil, in all arts, I always seek to establish a dialogue with these artists. It is an attempt to provide a counterpoint to this violence within our society. And this attempt of reviewing history has to do with a strategy that for me oftentimes means to deconstruct an image that has been crafted about marginalized, historically marginalized groups, blacks, indigenous, and women and others, in an attempt to build a new imaginary, a new iconography, in providing a counterpoint to what has been written and built visually beforehand. And then it's worth saying that many people refer to me as a historian. And I think it's a big praise. I enjoy that, but I need to state that my training is in the arts and visual arts. I'm very interested in cinema and other arts, but uh, it is important to state that because I like to think about history as a possibility of a dialogue vis-a-vis the art world, and this possibility of rebuilding this history through art, or at least rebuilding it, the history for today. For me, this is very important. And as I realize, and as I look at the many documents, I, I am Marcelo de Salete. I come from São Paulo, from the capital, but the large majority of my trajectory comes from the peripheries of São Paulo. At the university, I was able to see some texts, particularly from Quilombo Hoje and other artists were important for my training, that in some ways brought a perspective and a way of looking at this history, this diasporic history in Brazil, from a different standpoint, from an experience that tries to bring these characters to the center of the narratives and try to investigate these characters from that perspective. In the beginning of the 2000s, a course uh, at the Center for Black Consciousness or Awareness at the University of São Paulo, and interacting with people who were interested in reviewing our history, I had contact with texts that talked about colonial Brazil, thinking about the Black population in this context, talking about Palmares, particularly a very Atlantic-oriented professor. And as I dealt with these debates as well as these texts, I was interested in thinking and elaborating and reviewing these texts and finding fixtures in these texts through fiction. I knew this literature about Palmares, for example, that was known, but only within a universe that was much more universal. And this literature wouldn't come to us any other ways in talking about the reality of the history. So I've always read those documents and I imagined in how to rethink those documents from from a fiction standpoint. And for me, it was relevant when I thought about that, is to read those documents and those archives and think exactly about how, what were the fixtures, um, and the possibilities of interpretation of these archives in terms of what they didn't reveal directly in terms of what was written, but it was possible in order to have access to this information through fiction and utilizing it in terms of its potentials and its intriguing ways, so that as readers of these documents, we may reimagine this past and this history that oftentimes within these police archives and military archives are also fragments, uh, partial perspectives of that time period. And then I developed an interest in the year 2000, 2004, 2006 of starting to develop some stories, cartoons, through cartoons, and something that I am well acquainted and I have expertise, reasonable expertise to think about these plots. And these were part of texts that were directly related to Palmares, and slowly I started to broaden these issues in order to understand a bit more Brazil in the 17th century, in order to understand a bit more about the reality of this Black population during that time, and to choose some characters that would be interesting in terms of conducting that narrative in the format of cartoons. I'm going to start some images here. Isis, please help me keep track of time. Can you see the image? So these are some of the main publications I have so far that I have authored. The quadrinhos or cartoons. It started by the book Noite e Luz, 2008, and then the book Crossroads, 2011, and then Cumbi, 2014. And this is the publication year in Brazil, Angola, Zambia, in 2017. The first two books, Noite e Luz and Crossroads, are urban and very urban, and they talk about São Paulo and big cities in Brazil, and based on the experience of Black young people in the peripheries dealing with this context of those large cities in Brazil. Then I'm going to focus in this presentation on Cumbi and Angola Janga, a book from 2014 that came with these researchers about colonial Brazil in the 17th century that would then help me organize my work about Palmares. This work at first, Cumbi and Angola Jangi, were based on book one, a project. And in that sense, Angola Janga was a book that was more specific about the Palmares history, and Cumbi, a book dealing with context involving the Black population and also enslavement in 17th century Brazil. I realized then that this book, this project was broadened, and that it would be interesting to separate this project into distinct universes. I think it was the most, the best path, because this book separating them, otherwise they would be too, it would be too big of a book, too large. So separating them was the best choice. Cumbi deals with is a book that talks about, the title itself means sun, light, strength, fire. And I like to talk about this style because it's a direct reference to a large majority of African origin population that comes to Brazil. Kumbi is a word, a term from Kimbundu, which is one of the languages spoken in Luanda. And it's very important to remember that in colonial Brazil, we are talking about Africans that come to Brazil and they are forced to come to Brazil, and the large majority of them are Bantu origin. And they also came from regions such as Angola and Congo. And we are talking about over 70% of the people who came here. This, of course, has to do with their presence in our language and gestures and the ways we celebrate, actually, and some characteristics of our culture. But we are also talking about a history that to some extent has been erased. And oftentimes, the contours are not well perceived in our culture nowadays. So Kumbi provides title to this book, and it deals directly with 4 stories focusing on characters, so to speak, in different positions within the slave colonial period in Brazil, particularly end of 18th, 17th century in the northeast of Brazil, Pernambuco. These 4 stories in Kumbi are talking about conflicts and issues that happen in some way more updated, involving a few characters, such as the first story that is called Kalunga, that you can see here, a page of the story here, and in others, they deal with collective issues involving groups of riots, revolts, or involving Maroon communities that were called at that time Mocambos. These stories were in some ways inspired or perhaps referred to in some history documents by historians that brought different perspectives in order to think about colonial Brazil. And this book was an interesting reference for that, that deals with enslavement. And one of these texts, the author talks about conflicts that take place involving enslaved people. In this text, she focuses particularly in the trajectory of women. So issues of gender in colonial Brazil, and this is a story that involves 2 characters, a couple within this system of enslavement, and there's a crime that takes place in light of the objectivation of these objectification of these people. This served as a door, an entry to think or rethink about these relationships in terms of the intrinsic violence of these relationships involving enslaved people and slave masters, but also amongst enslaved people within the slave quarters, how they are transformed and they transformed one another.
De certo modo, de certa violência. Tem uma oposição grande nessa história entre
There is great opposition in the story of a character, a man who works in
esse serviço mais brutalizado nas fazendas, trabalho mais braçal.
So these are the ones who are more brutalized in this, in farms, and then you have someone who work at this master's house. So she has in some ways assimilated or incorporated, as you see by the sign of the cross, these values. And the story explored the ways of seeing these conditions of each one of these characters in this plot. Here you have some of the passages of the story, but in order to take advantage of time and our theme, I am going to talk a bit more about the book. I'm going to show you some images here of this story, Cumbi. I think that it's something interesting for us to address is that in the history of Brazil, it's very common when we talk about the Black population and Black culture, you locate and you want to.
É muito importante, sim, na nossa história, e a gente não pode esquecer disso, mas que é a questão dos orixás, do culto aos orixás, que vem principalmente a partir de...
Which is the orishas that have to do with Nigerian kingdoms, older kingdoms in the 18th century and 19th century, and that ends up spreading to several parts of Brazil. But we should not forget that this is one of the Black diasporic experiences in Brazil. This Bantu experiences is very large, north to south of Brazil, as much as it is present in religions, in the way we cultivate and celebrate through Mozambique, in Bigada, and other in Capoeira. But aside from that, we have other religious traits in Maranhão and other regions that we should not lose sight of. This porosity, cultural porosity that are a part of this mosaic of this Black diasporic experience in Brazil. Well, the book, Angola Janga, this book was then published in 2017 after 11 years in total of production. Long work within all these years. Cumbi also emerged and the book Crossroads, but every time I finished this work, I was going back to Angola Janga. This book deals with, in 11 chapters, with the history of Palmares, focusing particularly in its last centuries, the second half of the 17th century. And what does Angola Janga mean? I'm showing it here in Portuguese, sorry. Many people won't be able to read it, but translation will help us. Angola Janga is a term used amongst residents of Palmares using to refer to that place. In some documents, older documents, they say Angola Janga would be a translation of small Angola. Clovis Moura asserts that as much as other historians, but there are other versions as well for this term. So Ney Lopes asserts that this term may also be used to be translated as my Angola. He's going to use some other languages like Bantu to refer to this meaning, my Angola. And then in another text, Ney Lopes also draws attention to the book Brazil, stating that Angolan Janga is a variation of Kinyanga from Kikongo, which means trap. I think it has a lot to do with Palmares and Angola Janga in some ways. It is an interesting meaning. Some days ago, I was developing research about this term. And at a dictionary of Francisco Narciso Cobb, Portuguese, Kikongo Portuguese, this term in Nyanga happens in several spaces in Kikongo, and it's going to emerge particularly utilizing to talk about komada, which is a type of home that is covered with some type of grass that is used to protect from the sun and the rain. It is a similar meaning to the word mocambo and the way it was utilized throughout the 17th century. Well, see, these are some possibilities that allows us to understand the term Angola Janga. There's not only one definition for that, but these are traits that allows us to understand a bit more about that. When we talk about Palmares and Angola Janga, we are talking then about a space, a trajectory that starts in 1590, and then the last stories date back to 1930, and that's impressive. It's not possible to only talk about something that is localized as though it is a plot of 10, 15 years. It's over a century. 1695, 1730. So we had generations of people who were born in Palmares and who may have died there without getting to know enslavement within colonial modes and the extremely hierarchical ways of the colonial Portuguese colonies. So it should not be only understood as a way of resisting colonial powers, but also a group of thousands of people who together developed a way of having a life autonomy and were successful at that for a reasonable period of time, extent of time. So we could divide Palmares in 4 moments. First, 1590 until around 1650, when Palmares grew and it had 20,000 people in the Capitania Pernambuco and Serra da Barriga, in a region that was a bit farther away. Black people who were then enslaved were housed there. And then in 1630s, until we have this conflict involving the Portuguese and the Dutch in Brazil, and that then has the number of Africans running to Palmares is expanded from 1660 to 1680. There was a period of intense armed conflict involving Portuguese and Brazilian slaveholders, and there were victories at both sides of this war. And in 1678, we have an important conflict between an important military man, Fernão Carrilho, and Gangazumba, who was one of the old leaders of Palmares. Fernão Carrilho is able to impose to have an important victory. And then there is a peace accord between the Portuguese crown and the Palmares. And we have the agreement called Cucaú, one of the central points that I address in my cartoon. What happens in Cucaú, or in the context of Cucaú, that causes dissidence amongst the Palmares group, because one group sticks to Gangazumba and goes to Cucaú, while another group remains with Palmaristas from the Serra and the new leadership, which was Zumbi dos Palmares. In 1680. The group is divided, is split. Gangazumba is poisoned. And then remains Zumbi dos Palmares group, the group that was in these hills. What happens then with Cucaú is that there is this peace treaty. And those who go to this region of Cucaú, let me show you the map. These Africans in the region of Cucaú, in this region in Pernambuco, here you have a map of Brazil. Let me just locate you here. The map of Brazil in the Atlantic, and this is the Pernambuco Capitania. That's where it was located in the 1700s. Within that region, we have the Pernambuco Capitania and the main colonial villages, such as Olinda Recife, Porto Calvo, São Miguel, Serinhanhém. And this region here, this is where you had this hill or serra, Serra da Barriga, and this highest region is where several Palmaros Mocambos were. Palmaros was not just one Maroon. Mocambo or Maroon community, Quilombo, these terms are utilized interchangeably at different times of our history. So here you have the other regions like Zumbi, Macaco, Subupira, which was a military settlement, Aqualtune, Acotirene. And at that time in 1678, when we have this conflict that takes place here, Aqualtune, Acotirene, the Portuguese have struck an important victory. Then we have the peace accord or the accord or the treaty in 1678. Gangazumba then have an agreement with the Portuguese and they moved to Cucaú. Other historians that had elaborated it with Décio Freitas, Edson Carneiro, and others through documents, historical documents, and the movement of troops through the jungle. Nowadays, some people are already elaborating on the maps, possible maps, so that we can understand this conflict. But this is the most prominent map so far. Cucaú lasts 2 years and then it's destroyed. And something interesting for us to realize is that Cucaú had around 300, 400 enslaved Africans who became servants to the crown, Portuguese crown, who actually had to fight against other enslaved Maroon members from Palmares. But Cucaú is then destroyed. And if you would look at how perverse the system is, these people who had already acquired freedom, they are enslaved again, they are re-enslaved. Colonial powers do not recognize them as free people, even after this peace treaty. And somebody who's talking about this peace treaty is Sylvia, a historian. And let me continue here. Isis, how much time do I have? We have time, 20 minutes. Great. So you may stop me because I don't see the messages, but I can hear them. So then we had, after Cucaú, the fall of Cucaú, this village, between 1680s and 1695, a moment of intense conflict among colonial powers and Palmari residents settled there. These were several Maroon communities that were divided by 10, 20, 30 kilometers when the strategies utilized by Palmares members was used. It is interesting to observe that this is the same strategy utilized by Black groups in Maroon communities in different parts of the Americas, in Jamaica and Haiti. They utilized similar techniques so that they could then avoid direct conflict with these armed groups. And when these soldiers were walking through the jungle, through kilometers, they were exhausted by walking through the jungle. That's exactly when they would be attacked, and they had several important victories that way, and that's when the leadership of Zumbi dos Palmares emerges. Since the 1670s until 1690s, there are different documents addressing the leadership of Zumbi. So this was just one person, it seems, based on the documents. It was one person, and he would not negotiate with the colonial powers. He never accepted requests for peace treaties, probably based on the previous experiences of what had happened in terms of betrayals and the re-enslavement of the people. Documents state that Zumbi had become a leader when he was around 20 years old. He was already a recognized leader. And when there were these intense struggles, his leadership then emerges to the extent that he has called, he becomes the one who is entitled the immortal one, because he was very prominent amongst Palmaristas at that time. Well, by the end of the 1680s, in Pernambuco, there is a crisis in terms of sanitation crisis, a disease called mal de bicho that then leads, though on one hand the villages are weakened, on the other hand there was then this holy war against Palmares, because they evaluated that the best lands were located in Palmares, and then they became a target of colonial desire. It's important to state also that Palmares people were located in areas that were of difficult access, but they were not isolated. They had contact with colonials who were close to these lands. They exchanged merchandise with these people, taking food supplies that they produced in the Serra, that they cultivated there, small animals, spices, manioc, corn. They would exchange that with farm owners in the neighborhood, exchanging it with weapons and other goods. So there was close contact with farm owners, and there was actually farm owners collaborating with these Maroon community members. And part of this colonial army, and Domingos Jorge Velho was in charge of it. In order to destroy Palmares, it was important to threaten colonos or farm owners that negotiated with them. And they had to endure harsh penalties if they collaborated with these Maroon community members. So this goes to show that it was not a black republic that was completely isolated, but it was in contact with what surrounded them in important exchanges or commercial exchanges. In 1690, that's the moment when Paulistas that leave from Sao Paulo that move to the Northeast, they end up participating in this conflict against these Palmaristas. They were known by their conflicts with indigenous people. They go through other regions and participating in wars with indigenous people in 17th century Brazil, and then they moved towards Palmares, and the Paulistas, in the words of those times, they were the worst kind of people. They were not considered, so to speak, urban people. They were considered almost wild people, those troops, violent troops, that even in their passages through Pernambuco, the residents of colonial villages were afraid of them because they stole, they killed, they stole cattle, people. Large portion of their troops were formed by indigenous people that they violated during their trajectory and forcing them to be a part of their group. They would either do that or they would be killed. So these Paulistas are then called to combat the Palmares groups. And they are a part of this army, but they are not the only ones who collaborate to the downfall of Palmares. They are part of an army formed in the region of Pernambuco. But Paulistas have a key leadership role at that moment. And the main Mocambo in Palmares that is destroyed in 1694, January 1694, and it is destroyed. How? Why? Some of the reasons. Palmares was divided in several Mocambas, but over time, colonos, militaries, they ended up getting to know, mapping this territory. And these people in Palmares ended up having to more and more diminish their territory, and they ended up becoming strengthened within the main territory called Macaco under the leadership of Zumbi. There they built this big fence, and they ended up creating a fort with 4 or 5 meters high with several wooden fences, and they believed they would be safe there. And colonos then, because they knew the region or farm owners of, they built a road that would diminish this path amongst the different villages, and the strategy of surrounding them within this fortress and cutting off their access to water. Palmares is then destroyed in 1694. Many people are re-enslaved. We need to understand that we have thousands of people there. Around 10,000 people there. Many died, many were enslaved, others hundreds, and many others were dispersed through the region. Then we have then the other maroon communities are formed in the next decades. Zumbi survived 1694 attack, but in 1695 he is caught, and because of the betrayal under torture of one of his main leaders. And let me show you here some of these images.
Marcelo,
Os personagens. Oi.
agora seria interessante a gente passar para as tuas imagens, como que você construiu toda essa, né, essa história nos seus quadrinhos, para dar um tempo.
So how you have crafted, if we would like to then provide for some time for Q&A. So here we have some images for these characters in the plot Angola Janga. This is Soares, the main character in my plot. This narrative is going to be conducted through his trajectory, through the main Palmares facts. We have Zumbi and other characters, more fictitious characters like Andala, Rodrigues, who participated in the Rodrigues. This is Gangazuba, a leader from Palmares that came prior to Zumbi. The elaboration of the story, Palmares' story, emerged then through an intense research, taking as a reference historians such as this one, Décio Freitas, Flávio Gomes, Alves Filho, Edson Carneiro. So these are historians that had already written about Palmares, and on the other hand, we have works that would help us understand the traits of these Bantu cultures in Brazil. This book here, for example, that talks about cultures of Angolan origin. These are interesting references. After my research about these works here, of course, step by step, in building this plot,
Com os principais fatos sobre Palmares.
It was to elaborate the main facts about Palmares, trying to organize within the several stages what was most important for elaborating the story. After that, the beginning of crafting this screenwriting or this plot in terms of the main facts and characters, and how, since I am writing this the screenwriting for myself, it's a succinct narrative in order to record the images that were formed in my mind in terms of how this plot could be depicted. And then in this organization, in 11 chapters, the story of Palmares. And then, of course, since it is a plot that has flashbacks and different moments and characters, it was important to know which character for each one of these moments in this plot, when it would reemerge, the age range. It's a 50-year time span, and my way of conducting this narrative was, of course, visual, largely visual. A plot that is conducted through image. And this is an aesthetic choice because I didn't want the work to be in such a way that we would have an overlaying of images. I think we have the strength in terms of creating possibilities, reading possibilities of this plot that would be interesting to me, and hence it was important to explore this narrative.
Depois, o desenho dos personagens, um a um, para saber quem eram, né, esses personagens. Aqui, na verdade, são personagens que estão no livro Cumbi, tá?
So who were these characters in the book Kumbi? And then we have the famous small drafts. In order to know exactly who, what was the composition, the graphs and the visual art for each page, the layout for each page, which characters, what was important in terms of scenarios, as much as the objects that are frequent and related to the plot and some characters. For me, that was very important to summarize concepts, ideas, characters, and places for this plot. Then the designing, drawing of these pages, my work is manual. Nowadays, it's impossible to only do it all manually, but the large majority of it is manual. So these are Sulfite pages A3 size, in which I think about the layout of the page. I elaborate the design with more details. It is then when I think about exchanges and changes in this layout. And this page has a configuration in which and I finalize the page as it has happened here, because I see that as I go into the scene, it would be best to do it differently. I always like to think about the page as a puzzle, a big puzzle involving actions, characters, time, and involving details, small elements that you deliver slowly and that you narrate and you count on the reader in order to fulfill the gaps. This active reading for me is very important. I think it's the most interesting way of reading a cartoon. Then we have the finalized pages, A3 sizes. Sometimes I think in this page that I have utilized Nankin ink. I wanted to utilize acrylic ink that has different textures.
E desse preto e branco. E aí pegando referência, não é? Muito de artistas também latinos.
So then I would use as reference Latin American artists, such as Muñoz, Brecha, and several others that work very well with black and white art. So here are some materials that I utilize. A light table. Nowadays, I use paper sulfite for drafting, thinking about the layout for the page and organizing that. Some of the materials that I end up using more frequently since the Nankin pen, ink pen, correctives, and then taking all of that to the computer. And that's where the final layout of the page, I have balloons, onomatopoeia. I end up utilizing graphic design programs. I like to think about that afterwards, though sometimes when I'm elaborating designs, I'm already thinking about where the text goes in the onomatopoeia, but I like to think that when I see the whole story in the pages ready, I see that one page, it's well translated. I like to suppress that, particularly thinking about the roteiro, is though is if I have a dialogue, it's not like I'm going to include it. If I realize that the design, the organization, then addresses that in terms of images, in terms of the dynamics of these images. I sometimes like to suppress the majority of the text and then leave only what is more essential, what really matters for the page in order to reinforce.
Mas também para trazer essa possibilidade de
But also bringing this possibility of working with text and in most open ways in dialogues, exactly with this opening, poetic opening, these images that this poetics that images may bring. Then I like to think and have it ready by the end when I already have these images ready, and that's when I have diagram page by page. Well, Isis, I think that at first this is it. I always think that I have talked enough and that I'm taking too much time. So I'm going to leave the rest of the conversation for our Q&A. Thank you, Marcelo, for offering us his time and how your silent, the writing that I used to imagine all of that in your head, but now I have it recorded as personal records for these images that are so crucial in order to restructure the archives that we have in history. Thank you.